Today's headline is Blocking Traffic. Disgraceful lawlessness in Chicago Saturday. The subheadline says, Rioting and bloodshed, farcical proceedings of the authorities, rioters and police chasing one another with locomotives. This article originally came from Chicago on June 27th. It says, the Lakeshore Company moved no freight today and attempted to move none. There was perfect order in the yards all day. The officers stationed there to protect the company's property had nothing to do, as hardly a striker put in an appearance. The switchmen expect, however, lively work for tomorrow, knowing it to be the intention of the company to start out trains well guarded and able to resist the opposition of very large mobs. Believing the town of Lake Police to be in secret sympathy with the strikers, the railroad company has applied to the Hyde Park Department for aid. The strikers held meetings today and resolved to use every means within their reach to maintain their ground. Passenger train derailed. Friday night, after the strikers blockaded the track, the night mail train, consisting of 11 coaches, ran down the westbound track, but finding the track blocked, ran back and was switched onto the eastbound track and came on. At 51st Street, someone ran out and threw the switch, derailing the locomotive. After half an hour's work, the locomotive was placed on the rails and the train proceeded. Saturday's episodes. At 11 o'clock yesterday morning, two locomotives coupled together were run out of the Lakeshore Roundhouse and surrounded by police, and 40 of Pinkerton's men were back down the track and coupled the two cabooses. The train then started south on the main track through a large and ugly disposed crowd that lined both sides of the main road. The cabooses were filled with railroad officials, imported switchmen, reporters, 15 police, and 20 of Pinkerton's detectives. At first the train ran slowly, and the crowd easily kept up, and some ran ahead. The crowd alongside pelted the cabooses and locomotives with pieces of coal, stones, and anything they could lay hands on. The speed of the train was gradually accelerated until it was moving about 15 miles an hour, and the crowd was quickly left behind. A locomotive fight. Unfortunately, at this point, a Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul engine, and one belonging to the Nickel Plate Road, passed a crowd of strikers. The engines were on their way to the Englewood yards to do some switching for the roads to which they belonged. But as they passed the crowd, they were boarded by 100 furious men, who without ceremony took undisputed possession, forcing the engineers and firemen from their posts. The rioters immediately started at full speed in pursuit of the Lakeshore train. When the Lakeshore train slowed up at 60th Street, a switchman jumped forward and attempted to throw a switch under the moving cars. He succeeded just as the last caboose was passing, only the rear truck passing over the misplaced switch. The wheels, however, did not run off the track, but passed smoothly over the open switch to the continuing track. The train was overhauled at 62nd Street, and men on the pursuing engine attempted to make a coupling. They were foiled in this, as the police on the rear caboose used their clubs and prevented the coupling being made at that time. Then one of the men on the tender of the nickel plate engine picked up a coupling pin and threw it with all his force at Matt Pinkerton, who was standing in front of the caboose door. He dodged, and the heavy iron missile went crashing through the glass, only a few inches above his head. Pinkerton drew his revolver, an action that was instantly followed by the 4 officers by his side. But before a shot was fired, a perfect shower of coupling pins, links, and big lumps of coal rattled against the rear of the caboose and all around the officers and reporters who were standing on the platform. 2 or 3 of the latter were hit with lumps of coal, but none were seriously injured. Then the officers fired point blank into the crowd upon the tender, and 3 switchmen tumbled off to the ground. The pursued and pursuing engines were now running at over 20 miles per hour, but so close together that the fight was still kept up. A one-sided affair. It was, however, a one-sided affair, as all in the pursued train had taken refuge inside the caboose, except Matt Pinkerton and 2 of his officers, while there was a score of the strikers. The officers, however, had firearms, while the strikers, if they had them, did not use them. As the trains rushed through Hyde Park, the police fired several shots at the pursuing train, but without effect, except that a number of the strikers jumped off. The Lakeshore train now began to draw ahead, but the signal to slow up brought them to a standstill at Grand Crossing, and the strikers' train dashed into them. Then the strikers and their friends swarmed out and around the now helpless train. It was captured with all hope of escape cut off. As the strikers boarded the caboose cars, the first men sought out were the imported switchmen, and several of them were treated to a severe thumping. They were rescued just in time to prevent their being killed. Division Superintendent A.O. Armstrong was on the pursued train, and when he saw that escape was impossible, he ordered his engineers to allow the train to be taken back. The coupling was then made, and the train, now consisting of 4 engines, 2 boxcars, and 2 cabooses, was started back to the city. The strikers were the undisputed masters of the situation for the time, and they manifested their delight in the most unequivocal manner. They stood upon the tops of the cars and shouted and hurrahed until they were hoarse, and every railroad employee they passed on the way back gave them a cheer, and the big crowd at Root Street, from which point they started, nearly went mad with joy over the victory. In summing up the casualties of the trip to Grand Crossing and back, it seems that 4 of the men on the pursuing engine were shot, but none dangerously. Many persons were bruised and injured in various ways, and it is possible some of those who jumped or were thrown off the strikers' train may die. None of the police were hurt. A trap for the strikers. About 4:30 p.m., another train was made up. A number of Lakeshore police and Pinkerton men, as well as railroad officials, mounted it. It steamed slowly down to Englewood, followed by about 1,000 strikers. At Englewood, the train pulled out fast, and it had not gone far when an engine filled with strikers was seen in the distance. The train pulled out faster and faster, but the strikers were gaining on it. 2 engines, one in front and one in the rear, were propelling the 4 freight cars sandwiched in between, which the strikers were striving to overhaul. The strikers' engine was on the track used for incoming trains. She was black with men. On the tender, in the cab, on the footboards, on top of the horizontal, and on the roof of the cab, they hung in all positions. When the 4 cars were reached, the strikers whooped and shouted like madmen. On the 2 engines went, almost abreast. Soon the engine in the rear of the 4 cars was given a full head of steam, and the train drew rapidly away. When sufficiently in advance, the police deposited a detachment of their number unobserved at Grand Crossing to await the pursuing engine. Every inch of steam was crowded on by the strikers, but they had 2 powerful road locomotives pitted against them. Grand Crossing was finally reached, and then a long line of city-bound freight cars were discovered on the same track, down which the pursuing engine was coming at breakneck speed. And the strikers were forced to come to a standstill, just where the detachment of police had been left concealed. Down pounced the officers on the engine, like so many wolves. The men saw them coming and jumped and fell off the engine, landing in heaps upon the roadbed. Off they ran, down the road, over fences, and through the marshes. But the cab had been so packed that the driving crew were hemmed in and held until the police had boarded the engine. Jumping into the cab, Captain Hunt covered the engineer with his revolver. He and 5 others were thus caught in the cab. The engine was sidetracked and killed. The pursuers pursued. Another engine attached to a Chicago-bound freight train was boarded by the police and started after the strikers, who were fleeing down the road to the city. Down South Chicago Avenue, a group of 20 were seen to capture a wagon, tear the reins out of the hands of the driver, and lash the horses along the road. At this point, South Chicago Avenue runs parallel with the railroad track, and here another novel race began. This time it was between the engine and the wagon. The horses had a long start and held out until 1.5 miles was covered. During the race, the officers fired at the fugitives, and one horse received a wound in the back and dropped. The men were then given chase on foot, but only 4 of them were captured. Besides this group, many small parties of strikers scattered through the swamps and were followed by separate squads of police, who used their revolvers freely. The net result of the struggle was 1 train of freight forwarded to Eckerd, and 1 other train brought into the city. About 25 of the strikers and their friends, who gave chase to the outgoing freight, are spending the night in the Hyde Park and Greenwood jails. How imported switchmen fared. 5 men stood in Superintendent Wright's office yesterday morning, 2 of them being terribly battered up. One had a bad cut over his eye, his cheek was swollen, and he bore bruises all over his body. They were demanding their transportation back home. "We were taken into a rat hole," said the worst used up of the men, "and left to be killed. I was taken with 5 or 6 others and left in the roundhouse Friday afternoon. There was a fellow left with us who was called a detective. About 20 of the strikers came in and made a rush at us. The detective skedaddled the first one. There was no chance for us. The mob was armed with monkey wrenches, iron bars, coupling pins, and with iron ore. They threw me down, hammered me, and nearly killed me. I finally got away, bleeding freely. I met a policeman who stopped me, turned me around and asked me if my throat was cut. I told him that I had been mobbed at 43rd Street. He asked me if I had taken the place of the strikers. I said yes. He kicked me and said, "I wish they'd kill you. I am going to my home 20 miles the other side of Toledo." This story came from the great state of Pennsylvania, being reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer of June 28, 1886. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, now remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.